Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's EarthShift Global Brown Bag webinar. Today we've got Jeff Goetz from Fluor. He's going to talk to us about energy reduction, cost avoidance, and net zero accomplishments through occupant engagement. Jeff has got a number of very interesting stories to share with us and some great advice. So with that, I welcome Jeff.
Get a feel for what other sides are doing. And the reason I bring this up is you can learn a lot from outside of your own industry. So I want to bring up these common goals. Then I'll hit on the supply chain, and supply chain is more than being a preferred vendor. And more clients are getting smarter with their supply chain to see how it affects them. And that's where the commonality, the 80-20 rule, and the opportunities engaging the occupant and so forth come from. So the big picture is it really starts in the design, construction, our operations, and our maintenance of our facilities. If those four entities are not in line, we're going to have a hard time meeting any goals. Can we get everybody on mute, Holly?
Everybody should be on mute.
All right. I'm hearing background, so. Organic reductions are not just cost, but more on the big picture of the carbon. And the reason I'm going to be talking about carbon a lot today is the carbon taxes that are being rolled out throughout the world are going to have a big impact. And I get a lot of pushback from real estate groups on, well, yeah, we'd like to do recycling, but there's a lot of costs associated with it. That's a very small piece of the puzzle on that cost, because the carbon's going to actually offset that at the end of the year for the corporate big picture. So that goes on to the next part of the accountability and the buy-in. If you don't have all the sites bought in, you're going to have a hard time moving forward. And again, the supply chain, most of us may be in the supply chain of a customer. For example, Fluor supports a lot of customers, and our emissions hits them. So that gets into the excel to win topic of client focus. I try to pick random companies throughout every business line that Fluor has, and then which hits government, commercial, mining, industrial and pharmaceutical, oil and gas. Doesn't really matter. All of them have a commonality with them, in which I'm going to try to go through quickly. So some of these slides may seem like I'm going by fast. I'm intending to do that because I've got a lot of slides to go through. But we'll also have this on the EarthShift Global website, so that way you can look at this stuff at a later time. 2015, I called the year of the supply chain initiative. More and more companies, and even the U.S. government, bought into why the supply chain is so important. For example, Executive Order 13693 was issued on March 19th, 2015, and basically rolled out in more detail Executive Orders 13413 and 13514. Basically what it's saying is the government wants commitments from their supply chain and how their supply chain is going to help them reduce their carbon. And on there, these $1 billion a year businesses, for example, like IBM, Northrop Grumman, GE, Siemens, I think Honeywell, and some other companies, and even Fluor. Okay, these companies are making a commitment. But let's say you're on that list like Fluor, and your customer that you support is on that list. It's going to double affect you, because not only do you have to meet your fulfillment, but you've got to also help on your supply chain side your client's commitment. Which basically brings us back to what the government first rolled out with 13423 and 13514, where they're basically saying, here's our goals of where we want to be. And the biggest one is the 2030 net zero energy building requirement that they want. That's going to be a far stretch for the government. There's only a couple companies I've seen that's put out a 2030 net zero goal, which I'll show today. And you've got to really position a lot of strategy to accomplish this. The European Commission is also got the same initiative for net zero. And the web link below identifies their directives on all of that. So it's not just in the US base, it's actually worldwide that all these countries are trying to get to manage their carbon. Commercial goals, you have Procter & Gamble, they've probably got one of the most visible commitments around, along with Walmart. They communicate it very effectively, not just with their employees, but on websites. Everywhere you look, they're identifying what they want. Their 2020 goal, the third bullet down, having zero consumer and manufacturing waste go to landfills. I'm going to hit on that one a little later because of how important that is. And then their other one where they've rolled out their zero manufacturing waste to landfill, that program of where they focused on majority of their manufacturing sites, because that's where majority of their waste was being generated, which we commonly use that as the 80-20 rule, which again, we'll discuss a little later. More on the industrial side, IBM rolled out their programs. Fluor is very fortunate that we are the facility managers for IBM at 300 and some sites in the US. So this is a very good slide for me because it showcases that we are listening to our customer of saying they want 75% recycling and we're performing at 86, which is great because it helps them with a cost avoidance of landfill. So they saved $18 million. And on the other side of it is they're tracking this to make sure that they fulfill what their shareholders are looking for. And this basically goes into the next slides of where IBM is, I'll use their terms, mastering carbon management by balancing the trade-offs of their supply chain. So the day and age of the preferred vendor may not get you there if you're low bidder, because they're going to start looking at more of the big picture of saying, how is your company doing on energy conservation? How are you on water? How are you going to affect my scope 3 emissions? Because they're paying tax dollars on carbon with what your emissions are. Look at the metal and mining industry. They're basically saying there's $900 million of aluminum cans in our landfills today. That's a lot of money. And then they go on and say they want to have by 2015, 75% of all cans recycled. Well, that's a great goal. And they're getting pretty close to it. But let's look at what that 75% really is. That's equivalent to 1.3 gigawatts of generated electricity saved, or 11.8 million metric tons of carbon. So when the aluminum industry is saying, we really want to recycle, it's for the ultimate good of everyone. So that's where programs within your own companies can start rolling out aluminum recycling and basically put plastic bottles on the side and just go back to aluminum in the vending machines. And it's a win-win situation because aluminum, you get around 40 cents a pound when you recycle it, where plastics, you're getting 4 cents. So when you do the math, for example, if you had 40,000 employees worldwide, each person recycles 1 can a day, you've got about $500,000 of revenue generated just from aluminum cans. So it's a win-win where you get the recycling landfill avoidance from it and you get some revenue. The pharmaceutical side, they've gone a little bit more. They've put down their goals, but they also want their supply chain to understand the related footprint and prioritize their reduction targets. So they're looking at their supply chain saying, okay, I want you to understand me, but I also want to understand how you're doing yours. And it's quite the unique twist that is getting put on the industry. Now, this one I put in because it's unique, because Jindal Steel and Power just rolled out their first sustainability report in 2014. So it's never too late to start these programs. And this is great for Jindal Steel and Power because their CEO believes that waste to energy is going to boost the economy in India. And it's probably the number 3 thing for India to regain their financial stability. It's unique when you think of a power company that does a lot with steel and a lot with coal, that they're wanting to talk waste energy. Then you look at AEP, and they're talking about how they want their waste management to be able to develop programs to make sure that they get the PCB containing equipment safely contained and not into landfills. ExxonMobil, same thing with waste management. They go through the priorities. BP, again, waste, working with their contractors and suppliers. ConocoPhillips, the same concepts, improving energy and material efficiencies. And then they're also tracking their waste management. And you can even see on here that they had a blip in 2012 where they had a very large addition to their waste, but they're still tracking it. And it's very important on this because it really shows integrity on their part of saying, yeah, we had a mistake in our reporting and we're correcting it. Shell, again, they're identifying, going all the way back to 2003, all of their waste, what they're working on. And the key of this is all of these clients are telling you what they're working on and what their goals on and what we're focusing on. And that's where the supply chain needs to step up and say, hey, you know what? We see what you're focusing on. We see what you're trying to manage. We'd like to bring something to the table to help you. And that basically helps you get solidified in their supply chain. So why is carbon management in the supply chain so important? Well, a lot of us know what Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions are and how they break it down with the carbon, et cetera. But what I want to break it out with is carbon dioxide is about 81% of the greenhouse gas issues, okay, the emissions. Methane's 11%, nitrous oxide 6%, and fluorinated gases are 3%. So we're doing a good job of phasing out our HFCs with our fluorinated gases. But let's look at methane. The bottom, I think it would be on your slide, the bottom left, is showing how methane is in the emissions. And you look at natural gas, 33% of it is the developers of methane. But we don't usually hear propane and natural gas and that getting a bad rap. We hear usually coal. But coal's only 9%. And actually, it's less than 2.5 times, or less than 2 times what landfills produce for methane. So that's why more and more companies are looking at, landfill avoidance. How can we reduce this one? Because methane is actually 25 times more impactful to the ozone over a 100-year period than CO2. So I like to look at it and say that 11% is actually like 275% compared to carbon. So if we can tackle our methane issues, we can get a better control on our carbon emissions because they all tie together quite nicely. So the supply chain's effect on the Scope 3 emissions, Scope 1 direct, Scope 2 indirect, and 3 is the others, which is like your MSW and your wastewater disposal. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the web link on the bottom here, developed some new standards. And these companies that I've got listed here all signed up to test these new standards out to see how they were working. And it's quite amazing to see how well they were able to roll that out into their programs. And basically what they did was they said, hey, we want to look at these, how we can put these upstream and downstream emissions in connection with our supply chain. So when you think of it, the logistics people of the company for transporting the product that we might be making or the construction materials or any of that, or the waste generated during the manufacturing of this piece for the customer, they're looking at that now to say, hey, how can we streamline that? And it's very similar to what Walmart did in 2009 when they went to all their manufacturers. And at that time, Fluor was doing some work with Unilever. And Unilever was told, hey, you know what, guys? We'd love to have your product on the shelf, but you have a little bit too much waste associated with it. And that's when Unilever looked at it and said, you know what, you're right. And they stopped putting their deodorant products in boxes, and they're just the product itself. They eliminated the box because they figured it was no longer needed. And that's when more and more companies started doing the shrink wrap, you know, the little plastic around everything instead of putting it in cardboard boxes, etc. And it all is a trickle down of how people are looking at their emissions. On this one, talking about the waste generated, a company called Selling Construction in Seattle, Washington, they're a $500 million a year contractor. They started doing a recycling program, and they got a lot of attention from it. It saved them about $600,000 a year. So basically, they made 0.12% of their annual in their savings of 600 grand. Now, I know we've got a lot of different size companies on the phone, but what would 0.12% of your revenue add up to be? For Fluor, I think our revenue was like 40 billion. So 0.12% is $48 million. I'd be pretty happy with a $48 million bonus if we could get this rolled off, you know? So then you look at waste management as an organic process. It's actually a lot easier to implement than energy conservation because people can see the goals right in front of them. If you're saying we're going to do landfill avoidance and recycling, people can actually see all of the recycling that you're doing. If you've got bins out there and they're just heaped up full of aluminum, full of cardboard, full of paper, they know, hey, we're doing great. But when you're doing energy conservation, not too many people get to see the energy meter. And they're like, well, how are we doing? And if you're not communicating it every month and showing them, here's where we were last month, here was our goal, and here's where we came in, people lose focus on it really, really quickly. So that's why waste management can really sell off pretty quick with buy-in. I use this sign from the University of Wisconsin with Milwaukee where they're talking about recycling at work, and they identified on the bottom what their recycling goal was and where they are at date. So it's a really easy sign to put up, and it gets everybody's buy-in because they see that there's results being happening and they'll continue to do their work. Goals actually equal profits. I love this story from Walmart. They rolled out their zero waste program. They saved $231 million from the recycling, and they added $150 million in solar and wind energy savings. Net about $380 million of savings through this new program. Well, that's equivalent to 0.095% of their annual revenue. Now, the interesting thing is Walmart's $400 billion a year. If they were a country, they'd be the 25th richest country in the world. So that's why a lot of governments and other organizations are looking at what Walmart is doing, because they're like, even though it's completely outside of their business line, oil and gas will look at Walmart saying, hey, if they're doing it with their supply chain, we can do it with our supply chain. It doesn't matter which area you're in. Walmart has a goal of 80 or 100% landfill avoidance by 2025. They're tracking at 80.9% now. And again, remember what I said earlier, methane is 25 times more damaging than CO2. That's why the EPA came out with a program called WARM, Waste Reduction Model, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But this is where global corporations are taking advantage of landfill avoidance and carbon taxes. So here's the commonality, or the 80-20 rule. 80% of the effects come from 20% of your cause. So when you put it in a perspective, Procter & Gamble talked about it earlier about where they considered 95% of their waste comes from their manufacturing sites. Therefore, they're focusing on manufacturing sites to roll out their zero manufacturing waste to landfill, their ZMWTL program. It's the same concept that IBM uses with their energy usage. They focus on their top energy users out of their huge portfolio and focus on that, because 80% of their energy is used at basically 20% of their sites, which is their data centers. So they focused on how to reduce energy in their data centers to lower their overall costs, which brings more share value and then makes their shareholders happy, make everybody happy. And again, methane, 20% of it comes from landfills. So this is a great commonality. In big picture thinking, again, Siemens, German company, came out and said, hey, we're going to invest $112 million over the next 3 years because we want to be the first net zero industrial giant. And what they're basically focusing on are 3 areas: their facilities, their vehicles, and energy. Now, Siemens makes wind turbines, so the energy side of it, they're probably going to be pretty good on, because they either can roll out some more wind energy or they might be doing solar, but they're also looking at their facilities. And when you're looking at facilities, you have to have user occupant buy-in. And that is one of the things that they're investing in. Engaging the occupant, IBM, again, like I said earlier, Fluor does the facility management at over 300 sites, but we didn't start out that way. In 1995, we only had 14 sites. So this has grown through basically like a partnership of helping them meet their goals and how we're helping with our basically subject matter experts coming to say, here's some concepts you guys might want to look into. Because IBM is great at producing their software and their computers. Well, they still make a few mainframes. But let them focus on what they're good at and let our SMEs focus on what they're good at. Net result is as a team, they've delivered over 100 million in savings, and they've reduced their carbon substantially, saving the company like 500 million. So, talking about supply chain differentiators, we want to be able to go into and help our customers. And if they're a global customer, you've got to show that your footprint is also global and that you see the value of it worldwide. So, talking about occupant engagement. Actually, I used this one, but first of all, I actually want to talk on an IBM example. IBM, at the IBM Rochester, Minnesota site, it's 3.6 million square feet. And I think I saw Brett Mum's name on the list earlier. Brett was one of our electrical engineers at the site. He's now with Whirlpool. But IBM used to make a simple announcement in the summer months that we're now reaching peak energy demand. Please turn off all unnecessary electrical devices. Simple little announcement. Made it once a day, and they reduced their energy simply by getting the occupant to engage and saying that they were part of the solution. Fluor's done the same scenarios with trying to get our sites Energy Star. We did some retrofit projects, but more importantly, we communicated to our staff what our plans were. Our mid-size was our Greenville campus. Large campus was our Houston, 1.2 million square feet. Small sizes are 2 small buildings in Aliso Viejo, California. But all of it had the same concept, similar to the rollouts that IBM does, similar to how Procter & Gamble does it. You look at your main energy users and you focus there, your 80-20 rule. Global opportunities, different programs throughout the world that match up very closely to the U.S. Energy Star, just like the UE has theirs. So the programs actually overlap each other no matter where you're going at in the world. The opportunity is understanding the value of carbon. In 2013, California had a carbon cap and trade. They sold out through 2016 at $11 a metric ton. Big thing that came out of this was a story in the New York Times. And in December of 2013, where it basically identified that big oil bought all of that carbon because they anticipated it to go to $60 a metric ton. Basically, they're buying their futures. So it made financial sense to invest in carbon. Now more and more companies are sitting there going, well, how can we use our supply chain to invest in us? Basically help us lower our own carbon by minimizing our own investment. A lot of companies are going to their vendors and their supply chain saying, how are you going to help me get my number down to where it needs to be? And they're not asking you to go in and put stuff into their buildings. What they're doing is saying, look at your own carbon footprint. I need it lower because it hits my scope 3. And that goes back down to that landfill thing and then the EPA's waste reduction model. 40% of the waste comes from construction and packing materials and all of that. Amazon probably would like me to say this, but man, they do go through a lot of cardboard boxes. Now, if we could figure out a way to recycle those and get them back to them, they'd be very happy because not only would they have a cost avoidance of having to buy more boxes, but they wouldn't have the carbon associated with all those boxes going to landfill. I was very fortunate to work with Levi Strauss in 2011, and they had a great program at their distribution centers where they actually did reuse their cardboard boxes, repalletized them, and shipped them back. So that way they were minimizing cost of boxes, reusing items, and had the landfill avoidance. They were saving somewhere around $2.6 million a year just at the one distribution center in Nevada, just simply by saving cardboard boxes and reusing them. Well, by doing that, if they're using the Energy Star programs or even the EPA's programs, which is basically the same, they can go in and they can track all of the materials that they're recycling and get a carbon offset for their annual carbon sustainability reports. So this goes into the Energy Star program. Energy Star is free. It's got all of these great tools on it, and it will help you if you don't know where to start. If you want to figure out how to roll out a program at your company or your plant or your building, they've got a section in there that will break it out for you. It's easy to go in, you log in, you get your new account, and immediately you can start tracking your energy uses as long as you have your utility bills. And after you get yourself set up, most utility companies will enter your data electronically, and it'll be a lot easier for you. I always say, unless you track it, you can't manage it. And if you're not managing it, you can't improve it. So through this process, you can set up all of your buildings. Let's say you've got 12 buildings in different cities. You can now track all 12 of your properties and see where their goals are at one dashboard. It makes life a lot easier when you're doing the sustainability reports. And you can identify different templates and reports, and this is all, again, free with the Energy Star Portfolio Manager. Once you have everything figured out and you're like, man, we really need to save some money, let's do some energy improvement projects. Well, the best thing to do is go to your local utility company and say, hey, what type of rebates do you have? But more importantly, it's better for you to know what it is before you ask them. If you can go onto this website, www.dsireusa.org, which is basically a database of state incentives and rebates within the United States, the screenshots on the right will pop up the United States. You can zoom into whichever state you want to look at. Just click on it and it'll tell you how many policies and incentives are in that state at that time. Then you click on that state and it breaks it down and you can find your utility company in there. So that way you have a head start on what you can kind of ask them for. And here's the biggest secret of it. If you make it their idea, you'll get a custom incentive, which is better than the prescribed incentives that are typically in their website. So Energy conservation reductions sustain a corporation's growth. I know a lot of people say, well, we got to use energy to make money. We got to do this. We got to do that. I agree. To make money, you have to spend money, but you don't have to waste money. And a lot of times you see corporations that their lights are left on all the time. It's in a manufacturing facility, third shift, nobody's there. Why are all the lights on? Why is the compressed air still leaking? Why is this? That's all waste. We can trim that down and sustain the corporation by making our reductions. Waste reductions isn't tree hugging. It is not, oh, we're going to recycle to save the environment. We're going to recycle to save our carbon taxes. We're going to recycle to make ourselves more profitable. And if we look at what we're recycling, aluminum versus plastics, we can actually help many industries in the world by going back to aluminum. And basically, I like to use this thought process. Let's say a client comes walking into your offices or wherever you're at, and your sustainability report says certain things, but when they walk in, they don't see recycling cans. They don't see any concepts of energy management or landfill avoidance. That perception is becoming reality to them, and that first impression is going to be very hard to break. So it's very easy to roll out the recycling programs and explain to everybody why we're going to do it. The funniest story I've got on that one was Fluor's office in the Netherlands decided to take out all of the trash bins in offices and make centralized trash locations on every floor. So they went from like I think it was 400 or 500 individual trash cans down to like 60 or 80 centralized bins through the building. At first, everybody griped about it, but within 7 days, everybody bought into it and said, you know, this isn't a bad idea, you know, because I'm printing less, I'm wasting less paper, and I'm actually, gets me a good excuse to get out of my office. Well, the win-win for this was now we only have 60 to 80 locations to pick up trash, not 400 to 500. So it reduced our costs for our cleaning crew. It reduced our carbon footprint because we had less waste. And we did a lot better in recycling because actually when people went to a central location, they recycled and put things in the proper location versus just taking the easy way out and throwing it in the trash can under their desk. Every employee and occupant participates and they count. They need to look at it as there's a 10,000 piece puzzle in front of them, and we don't have a complete picture. About and that is it's so many great results. Companies that know your business, you got help me out because the cost is I look at total cost of ownership when you're looking at replacement parts. And then think outside of the box. Basically, look at like the Walmarts of the world, see what they're doing. Because just because they're not in your industry doesn't mean they don't have good ideas. And here's an interesting pattern back to the Walmart. Walmart rolled it out in 2009, 6 years later. The US government and others are rolling it across their supply chain too. In sustainability, our goal is to help people with the win-win. Help them identify what's important now, but help them get positioned to what's important next. Because that's what we have to do every single day, is position for what's coming up next. Because if you fall behind that 8 ball, it's really hard to get back ahead of it. Innovation, quality, reliability, and similarities. This is how the supply chain is chosen. It's not always on the lowest dollar. It's how you can help make them more money. And this is actually Fluor handed these out for Engineers Week, and we were able to take these to during we did a lot of presentations for elementary schools and high schools, and we took them to the students and handed them out. And basically, it could be a two-dimensional puzzle, but the 6 pieces pop out and you can make a cube out of it. And what I always love telling the students is, you know, you're given all these different pieces in your time at school of how to learn, and you can put your pieces together and meet it in a framework. Or you can think a little bit more creatively and make it out of a box. Same goes through for our organizations in the professional world. Is we have all the programs in place in our companies. We have a framework that we typically set up, and it might be the same framework we've had for 25 years. But to be innovative, sometimes we got to look at that frame and see if we need to keep it or if we need to make it into a new box. I believe I'm right on time, so I can take about some questions now. But thank you, everybody. Are there any questions?
Hi, Jeff. Thank you very much for your interesting talk. We've had quite a few people interested and sending me chats. The first one is, Jeff, do you recommend that we read our customers' sustainability reports to find opportunity?
Absolutely. As you can see, the PowerPoint I put together has a lot of oil and gas and pharmaceutical, industrial. Those are our clients at Fluor. And yeah, I read theirs all the time to keep up to date with what they're looking at. For example, ExxonMobil and BP, they've been working diligently on reducing their carbon, and they've invested, on average, $6.2 billion a year for the last 3 years each on their gasification process and how to knock out more of the chemical out of the air. I mean, great opportunities to identify, oh, this is what they're working on. We need to go talk to them. So yes, I highly recommend it.
Okay, great. Someone else writes, how does the reduction in prices paid for recycling change the picture? Municipalities are now being asked to pay to get rid of recycled materials. Isn't this likely to affect companies as well?
Yes, it is. And that's where I would go and look at the EPA's waste reduction model and work with your tax accountants to say, okay, if we're paying the carbon tax, how much are we paying per year per metric ton? And then start looking at how much you're paying for your recycling. Most likely you're paying pennies on the dollar on the recycling cost compared to what your carbon tax would be. So even though they're charging you for it, as this innovation rolls out and more companies are starting to figure out ways to recycle, and there's a lot of smart people out there that are finding out what they can build out of recycled material. I just read that Whirlpool, and this one's for you, Brett, is actually taking the used water filters. You can if you send them back in and you'll get a credit back from Whirlpool, but they use those cartridges in concrete mix and in other items. So that way they have landfill avoidance. So people are getting more creative on what they can use the recycled product for. And the other part of this is, if we actually recycled more and got the recyclable, the good product out of the waste stream, then it opens up the avenue for waste to energy facilities to be more profitable, because then we don't have people having to pick in the, I don't know if you guys are familiar with waste to energy, but the most expensive part of waste energy is actually picking through the garbage that's coming through before it can get combusted to make sure none of the junk is in it. You know, like it used to be light bulbs and all of that would get thrown that have to get picked out in different ferrous metals. If we do a really good job of recycling before the trash goes, we actually have a perfect waste stream to go right into waste energy, which would be another stream for the American public to get into for new energy, and it would be considered renewable energy.
Mm-hmm. I just want to remind our listeners that I am collecting questions from the audience. If you would send them to me privately via chat, and I'll continue with some other questions that we have for you, Jeff. I have someone that said, you know, great talk. I love the 80-20 rule, and does this mean that we can move on to, I mean, at what point do we move on to the 80%?
Actually, when you're doing the 80-20 rule, what we've done with IBM was when we identify the biggest items and our biggest users, we can start rolling that out throughout the whole entire portfolio. But it's at a different investments level, because it's going to be hard to compete for dollars when you're looking for a small energy reduction. That's where I always go back to the Desire USA, the database for state incentives, because if you can get some incentives to help you get your ROI down to like 18 months, you'll get the money from corporate guaranteed, because it's going to be hard to be 18 to 24 months on a payback. So the 80-20, use it as a template for the big users, and then start rolling it out throughout the whole portfolio where it's applicable.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, can you give some examples of how to engage occupants or employees?
Yeah, I talked about it a little bit on the presentation, like how IBM would make their peak energy demand announcements. The other one is, and this is a study I'd read, that majority of companies, 34% of their staff have only been with the company less than 3 years. Basically identifying we have a large turnover of staff. So if you make an announcement like last year, you shouldn't make that announcement this year again, next year again. And I've had this discussion, and people are like, well, I don't want to pound it into their heads. I'm like, you have to realize that only like 30-some% of your company has probably been with the company more than 10 years. The majority of the staff, more than 50%, are less than 5 years with any company. And that was an HR document I'd read online. And it just blew my mind to see how much churn are in companies. But then I was out at a client site this week, and they were talking about that one of their vendors, basically in the last 5 years, has rotated staff 3 times. So the knowledge that's inside that facility is gone. And then they're always continually retraining. And that's where it dawned on me again, going, you know, if we don't continue to tell people our goal and our initiatives, how are we going to get them engaged? Because we're assuming, hey, I told them 5 years ago, they should still know it. And the fact is, we have to tell them all the time. It's like my kids. You got to tell them like 10 times a day. I mean, that's exaggerating, but we just need to make sure it's on our intranet pages or whatever, saying corporate goal is the following, so that way everybody knows what is the goal. Communication's key.
And on sites that do not have sophisticated building controls, are your Do you have any thoughts on where to start to drive savings?
Yeah, actually, that reminds me of, we have I talked about Levi Strauss in Nevada. When we helped them on their project, their control system it showed its age. It was at the end of useful life. It's time to get updated. So what we ended up doing was we identified what we would recommend, and then they did a great job in meeting with Nevada Power, talking through their idea. Nevada Power offered them a 30% rebate on the cost of a new system. So they put in this new system, which was I think it was $100,000. They got $30,000 back, and within the first 11 months, they had the energy savings paid for. So it was paid for in less than a year. And they ended up getting savings around 25 cents a square foot, and it was not a sophisticated building control system that they put in. It was basically just to run it properly. And then if they wanted to invest in more sophisticated controls later, they could. But really, it comes down to looking at what type of rebate structures are in place and understanding how quickly you can get a payback. What they had was they had some refrigerant units that were running 24/7. Well, they didn't need that. So when you were able to turn off that much energy, and then along with some of their lighting systems on third shift when no one was there, it really impacted their bottom line very quickly. So yeah, you don't have to have sophisticated controls to get savings.
Somebody else writes in, our experience has been that recycling costs more than just throwing it away, yet you referenced recycling as a cost avoidance. Can you explain?
Yeah, and that I try to hit on that one early by identifying the big picture. We get pushback from our real estate groups saying, yeah, we'd love to do recycling, but it's costing us more than it is just to throw it away. Well, that is really not looking at the total cost of ownership of that carbon. It may be cheaper up front to throw it away. It's kind of like going out and buying a very low efficient 50 horsepower motor versus the high efficient 50 horse motor. If you put the low efficient one in, it costs you 50 times more over the life of that motor to run it versus the high efficient, but nobody looked at the total cost of ownership of the motor. Same goes with the waste and recycling programs. If you track your recycling and you're able to identify it, kind of like in the waste reduction program the EPA gives you for free, you can give your tax accountants at the end of the year, here's how much we avoided from landfill. They use the tool and they can reduce your carbon. And if you're paying a carbon tax, if you're a global company, you've just made a great investment, which may have cost you $10,000 in recycling costs, but saved you $10 million in carbon taxes. So it's a pretty good return, but you've got to look at the big picture of that as a cost avoidance. It may have a small cost up front, but it's a big reduction in the end.
Someone says, I heard you speak last year about how you can implement energy conservation programs within the current budget because of rapid payback. Will any of these solutions pay back fast enough to avoid needing separate capital approval?
Yeah, actually, I bet that's from Lisa. We did that with Levi. With the energy program, the new building automation system that they put in, it paid back in less than a year. And they basically told us that if you could bring that twice on Sunday if you want, is how they put it. Because as long as they had the budget, because they already had their annual budget for energy, and if we were going to cut their energy by so much and it would pay for the investment, they would use that without having to go back to corporate for investment money. And that's where a lot of this can be as simple as like IBM did when they announced their peak energy demands, please turn it off. And what you can do is once you get the buy-in from your user groups to start turning things off, let's say 2017 you have a budget of $5 million for your utilities, and you roll out these announcements for peak energy, and you researched a little bit on, you have some units that are 25 years old at their end of their useful life, and you invested a little extra to get the high efficient replacement for them. Next year's budget is going to be down like $4 million for energy because you saved $1 million in that energy cost that first year. Well, that million that you saved, if you did your homework right, is going to pay for that. And then that's when you work with corporate and say, hey, we want to do this to reduce our operating costs. And it's also going to reduce our carbon. Can you work with us without cutting our budget every year? Because we'd like to use the money we save every year into a bucket for these energy projects. And usually most corporations are pretty good about giving you some of it back. You won't get dollar for dollar back from corporate, but you might get like 30 to 35% of it. And that's all. It's always a better start with 35% of what you save than zero.
Mm-hmm. Can you give a few examples of the rebates you were able to get on projects and how much?
Yeah, I had showed some of those Fluor sites, the Houston facility. That one we did new chillers, new variable frequency drives, and new pumps. And we got over $100,000 back from the utility. When we did the lighting retrofits, the white roof and the air handlers in Greenville, we got over $60,000 back. And I can't remember the exact number for Southern Cal Edison, but all of the projects we did, we worked with our utility before we did them, so that way we got rebates. Levi Strauss, like I mentioned earlier, they got 30% back on their building controls from Nevada Power. IBM does a great job in Raleigh, North Carolina with Duke Energy. Duke's got very good programs, and they really work well with their clients. Every utility company has initiatives to disperse their incentive money every year. So if you guys have money at fourth quarter, that's when most utility companies are looking at their big bucket of incentive money that they've got to get burnt through by the end of the year. So it's a really good time frame to call utility companies for their ideas.
Good to know. And one more here. When you reference the Energy Star website, can you give any quick tips on how to use the site?
Yeah, the site, I'll warn you right now, it'll kick you off. I mean, you'll be working on it and all of a sudden it just kicks you off and you're like, what? But don't worry about it because it auto saves all the time. So my daughter has to use this PowerPoint online for her school, and it does the same thing. It saves all the time, but it kicks me off all the time when I'm trying to go in there to see what she's doing. Either she's got it set up to kick me off all the time or it's just one of those flukes. But the other thing on the Energy Star one would be do take the tutorials and take the online training courses because it really helps understanding how that program is set up. And then don't worry about the data that you're putting in there. They don't share it. It's not like it's going out to everybody to see. It's just a tool for you to use. And the ultimate goal is for everybody to reduce their energy. And that the EPA programs, the EPA Energy Star was set up in like 1990. The waste reduction model was set up, I think it was about 5 to 7 years ago. Both of them are very nice tools, and you can't beat the cost.
Okay. Well, we're nearing the end of our time here, and Jeff, I wanted to thank you for a very interesting and informative PowerPoint that you've shared with us. I would like to encourage our listeners to tune in to next month's Brown Bag with Marco Villares on October 11th at 1 o'clock. Eastern Standard Time. His title is Early Application of LCA to Lab Research to Enhance Technological Development. And if anyone has any further questions for Jeff, you can find his information either from our website or we'd be happy to forward anything to him. So thank you again, Jeff, for everything, and look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.